The alarm in my ear crackled to life 2 seconds before the doors of the great hall sealed shut behind me. That was the first sign something was wrong. Royal doors on Threxos never sealed during a ceremony. They stayed open for the gods to watch, or so the priests always said. But I heard the heavy click of the locking bolts, and every hair on my arm stood up. My name is Ethan Cole. I was not supposed to be anywhere near the front of this hall. I was hired muscle, a human pilot turned bodyguard, brought along only because protocol demanded that every allied species send someone to witness the wedding of Princess Useri Vantor. I was the seat filler nobody wanted. The chair at the very back, past the musicians, past the food, practically in the hallway. And yet here I stood, closer to the throne than I had any right to be, because 2 minutes earlier, a serving alien had stumbled into me carrying a tray of drinks, and in trying not to spill anything on the royal guests, I had drifted forward without noticing. Now the doors were locked, and every guard in the hall had a hand on their weapon. I looked around. Thousands of guests filled the hall, aliens of a dozen different shapes and colors, wrapped in robes that shimmered like oil on water. At the center of it all stood Princess Useri, tall and pale blue, with eyes like polished silver. Beside her stood the groom, Prince Cavel Dorn, son of a rival noble house. Between them, the old priest had frozen mid-sentence, his hand still raised over a golden bowl of ceremonial fire. Something had interrupted the vows. I felt it before I understood it, a change in the air, like the moment before a storm. The guards near the side entrance were speaking into their collars, low and fast. Nobles near the front began to whisper. A woman 2 rows ahead of me clutched her partner's arm. Then the king stood up. King Threxon Vantor was not a large being, not compared to some of the towering guests in that room, but when he rose from his throne, the entire hall went silent in under 3 seconds. He raised one hand, and I noticed it was shaking. Just slightly, just enough for someone trained to notice small things to catch it. "There has been a violation of the sacred vow," the king said. His voice carried without any device I could see, bouncing clean off the domed ceiling. "The House of Dorn has broken the marriage contract before it was sealed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I did not fully understand what a marriage contract violation meant on this planet, but judging by the way half the room turned to stare at Prince Cavel, it was serious. Very serious. Prince Cavel's face had gone the color of ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but the king's guards were already moving toward him, forming a slow, deliberate wall between the prince and the throne. I should have stayed still. I should have kept my head down and let this alien drama play out without me. That was the smart thing to do. That was the thing every training instructor I ever had would have told me to do. Instead, I noticed something the guards had not. A figure near the east wall, dressed like one of the musicians, had a hand resting inside a long instrument case. Except the case was shaped wrong for any instrument I had seen that night. It was too rigid, too straight, and the person holding it was watching the king, not the stage. I did not think. I moved. I crossed the space between us in a few quick steps, closing the distance before anyone else even registered the danger. As I reached him, the man's hand tightened on something inside the case. I grabbed his wrist and pulled it wide, away from the king, away from the crowd. The case fell open, and a short black device clattered to the marble floor, a tool built for one purpose only, and it was not making music. The hall erupted into chaos. Guards surged forward. Someone screamed. The man I was holding twisted hard, trying to break free, and for a moment we grappled in a tight, ugly struggle that felt far too long, and was probably only a few seconds. I got a solid grip on his shoulder, turned my weight against his, and put him down on the floor without letting him reach for anything else. 2 guards were on him instantly, pulling his arms behind his back. I stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by nobles who stared at me like I had grown a second head. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the crackle of the ceremonial fire and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then the king spoke again, and this time his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow felt more dangerous than the shouting before it. "Human," he said. "Step forward." I froze. Every instinct told me to keep my head down, to let the ambassador handle whatever came next, to disappear back into the crowd where I belonged. But when a king on an alien world tells you to step forward in front of thousands of witnesses, there is no version of that request you can politely decline. I walked toward the throne, aware of every eye in the hall following me. My boots echoed against the polished floor. Princess Useri watched me approach with an expression I could not read, somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. Prince Cavel, still surrounded by guards, stared at me with something closer to fear. I stopped a respectful distance from the throne and offered the small bow the ambassador had drilled into me before the ceremony. It felt clumsy now, out of place, like wearing the wrong uniform to the wrong war. "You disarmed an assassin in my court," the king said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "With your bare hands, without hesitation, without waiting for my guards to act." "I saw something wrong," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I did what anyone would do." A murmur ran through the crowd at that. I would learn later that it was not in fact what anyone would do, not on Threxos, not in a culture where combat was carefully ritualized, where nobles trained for years to fight only in controlled, honorable duels, where nobody simply threw themselves at danger without a formal challenge first. The king studied me for a long moment. Behind him, I noticed his advisors exchanging glances, some worried, some calculating, one or two openly hostile. "What is your name?" the king asked. "Ethan Cole, your majesty." "Ethan Cole," he repeated, as if testing the shape of the words in his mouth. "You came to witness a wedding, and instead, you saved my life, and perhaps my daughter's future along with it." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The king turned then, slowly, toward the golden bowl of ceremonial fire, still burning between the two abandoned wedding thrones. He looked at Prince Cavell, whose family's guards were being disarmed one by one around him. He looked at his daughter, standing alone now at the center of the hall, her wedding gown catching the firelight. And then he looked back at me. "There is an old law in this world," the king said, and something in his tone made the entire hall lean forward to listen. A law from before my grandfather's time, rarely used, rarely even remembered outside the oldest texts. When a marriage vow is broken by treachery inside these walls, the king may choose a new protector for his daughter, from any soul present in the hall, regardless of rank, regardless of birth. My stomach dropped. I did not understand the full weight of what he was saying yet, not really, not in that moment. I only understood the way the room had gone completely still, the way Princess Yseri's silver eyes had widened just slightly, the way even the guards seemed to be holding their breath. I glanced toward the back of the hall, hoping to catch sight of Ambassador Owen Marsh, hoping for some kind of signal, some kind of guidance. He was there, near the doors, his face pale, his hands pressed flat against his sides like he was bracing for impact. The king raised his voice so that every guest, every noble house, every representative from every allied world could hear him clearly. "Tonight, this hall bore witness to betrayal," he said. "And tonight this hall will bear witness to something else entirely." He extended one hand toward me, and the gesture felt final, like a door closing somewhere far behind me, sealing off the life I had known just an hour earlier. "I choose the human," the king said. The words landed in the silent hall like a stone dropped into still water, and I felt every ripple of it move through the crowd, through the guards, through Prince Cavill's stunned expression, through Princess Yseri's unreadable gaze, and straight through the center of my chest. I had come to this wedding as an afterthought, a body to fill an empty chair, a name on a guest list nobody expected to matter. I had no idea, standing there in the firelight with a king's hand raised toward me, that I was about to become the most important person in this hall, on this world, and quite possibly in the history of my entire species. I only knew that something enormous had just begun, and there was no way to walk back out through those sealed doors and pretend I had never heard my name. The king's hand stayed raised toward me, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath along with him. I did not move. I could not move. My mind was racing through everything that had just happened, trying to find the exit, the loophole, the polite way out of whatever this old law actually meant. But the king's guards were already stepping toward me, not with weapons drawn but with something closer to formal escort, guiding me the last few steps to stand directly before the throne. Princess Yseri had not said a single word since her father spoke. She stood near the ceremonial fire, her wedding gown still catching the light, her silver eyes locked on me with an expression that was somewhere between shock and quiet calculation. I got the sense, even then, that she was the only other person in that hall thinking as clearly as I was. Prince Cavell Dorn, on the other hand, had gone from pale to furious. His guards had been disarmed, but his voice had not been silenced, and he found it now. "This is an insult," he shouted, his voice cracking through the stunned quiet of the hall. "You would replace the son of a noble house with a hired sword from a species that has been part of this alliance for less than a decade." The king did not even glance at him. "Your house tried to have me killed in my own court," the king said, his voice cold and flat. "You forfeited the right to question my choices the moment your man reached for that weapon." "I had nothing to do with that," Cavell snapped. You cannot prove my house ordered this. We will prove it, the king said. In time. For now the law stands, and the law is clear. A tall alien with deep green skin and an ornate chain of office stepped forward from among the king's advisors. I would learn later that his name was Chancellor Baron Ashcroft, though the name sounded strange even to my human ears, borrowed from some old trade agreement generations back. He bowed low to the king before speaking. Your Majesty, the Chancellor said carefully, the old law does exist, but it has not been invoked in 300 years. There are conditions. The chosen protector must accept the role willingly. He cannot simply be handed a title against his wishes. The king's eyes shifted to me for the first time since he had spoken my name. Then let him choose, the king said. Every eye in the hall turned toward me at once, and I felt the weight of every single one of those stares pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. I looked at the king. I looked at Princess Useri. I looked at the ambassador standing frozen near the back doors, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. I thought about my orders, my contract, the quiet, unremarkable life I had been living as a low-ranked security escort on a world that mostly ignored me. And then I thought about the man with the hidden weapon, about how close that device had come to reaching the king, about how nobody else in that entire hall had been fast enough or reckless enough to stop it. Your Majesty, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, I do not fully understand what this role requires of me. I am not a noble. I am not trained in your customs. I am a soldier, nothing more. That is precisely why I have chosen you, the king said. My daughter has spent her entire life surrounded by nobles who fight only in rehearsed duels, who follow rules older than the mountains, who would rather lose a war with honor than win one without it. Tonight, a stranger from a world we barely understand saw danger, and moved before anyone else even recognized it as danger. That instinct cannot be trained. It can only be chosen. I glanced at Princess Useri again. She had not spoken, but she was watching me now with a different kind of attention, sharper, more focused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had just been placed in front of her without warning. What exactly does the role involve? I asked. The Chancellor answered before the king could. The chosen protector becomes bound to the royal house. He stands beside the princess in matters of state and matters of danger. Depending on the princess's own wishes, the bond may remain one of guardianship only, or it may, in time, become something more formal. I understood the careful wording well enough. This was not simply a bodyguard position. This was something closer to a political marriage, or at the very least, the beginning of one, wrapped in enough formal language to make it sound like a job description. The hall was utterly silent, waiting. I looked at Princess Useri one more time, and this time, she spoke for herself. I did not choose this match either, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, cool and controlled despite everything that had happened around her. I was promised to Prince Calvel before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. If my father's law offers me a different path tonight, I would rather understand what that path is before anyone decides it for me. It was a careful answer, diplomatic in a way that told me she was far more skilled at this game than her age suggested. She was not accepting me. She was not rejecting me either. She was simply refusing to be handed off like property without a say in the matter, and I respected that more than I expected to. Then decide together, the king said. But decide quickly. This hall has already witnessed enough uncertainty for one night. I stood there, caught between a king's command and a princess's careful neutrality, feeling more out of my depth than I had felt in any mission I had ever taken. I thought about walking away. I thought about telling the king, respectfully but firmly, that this was not my fight, that humanity had enough trouble navigating alliances without one of its own accepting a role nobody back home would understand or approve of. But I also thought about the ambassador's warning, given to me quietly before the ceremony began, about how fragile humanity's standing still was among these older, more established species. One wrong move, one perceived insult to a royal house, could unravel years of careful diplomacy. Refusing a king in front of his entire court, in front of representatives from a dozen other worlds, might be exactly that kind of wrong move. Your Majesty, I said slowly, if the princess is willing to walk this path with me, at least until we understand where it leads, then I am willing to accept the role you have offered. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd again, quieter this time, more thoughtful than shocked. Prince Cavell's face twisted with something ugly, but his guards held him back before he could say anything the king would not forgive. Princess Useri studied me for a long moment, before giving the smallest nod I had ever seen someone give, while still meaning it completely. Then it is decided, the king said, and this time his voice softened, just slightly, just enough for those closest to the throne to notice. Ethan Cole of Earth, you are named protector of House Vantor, bound to my daughter's safety, and by extension, bound to the future of this kingdom. The Chancellor stepped forward with a small, ornate box, opening it to reveal a simple metal band, dark and unadorned compared to the jewelry worn by everyone else in that hall. He offered it to the king, who took it and turned to face me directly. This mark will identify you to every guard, every noble, and every ally of this kingdom, the king said, sliding the band onto my wrist himself. It was cool against my skin, lighter than I expected, but the moment it settled into place, I felt a strange certainty that removing it would not be simple. Wear it, and know that from this moment forward, you speak with the authority of this house when protecting my daughter's life. I looked down at the band, then up at Princess Iseri, who was watching the exchange with an expression that had settled somewhere between resignation and quiet interest. This is not how I imagined tonight ending, she said quietly, only loud enough for me to hear. I imagine it's not how anyone in this room imagined tonight ending, I replied. The faintest hint of a smile crossed her face before she caught herself, and smoothed her expression back into something more composed and royal. Behind us, I heard Prince Cavil being led from the hall under guard, his protests growing fainter as the doors opened to let him through. Somewhere near the back I caught a glimpse of Ambassador Marsh finally moving again, pushing his way through the crowd toward the front, his expression somewhere between horror and disbelief at what his lowest-ranked security officer had just become. The king raised his voice once more, addressing the entire hall. Let it be known across every allied world, he announced, that tonight, this kingdom was saved, not by ritual, not by rank, and not by tradition, but by instinct and courage from an unexpected place. Let that be a lesson to every house that believed humanity had nothing to offer this alliance. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, scattered among the crowd, but it grew steadily louder as more guests found their courage to join in, until the hall rang with the sound of it. I stood there in the middle of it all, a metal band cool against my wrist, a princess beside me who had not chosen this any more than I had, and an entire kingdom now watching to see what I would do next. I had come to this wedding expecting to sit quietly in the back row and disappear into the crowd before the night was over. Instead, I was standing at the center of a political storm I barely understood, bound by an ancient law to protect a woman I had met only minutes earlier, with an entire noble house now furious enough to want me removed from the picture by whatever means necessary. Somewhere beyond those sealed doors, I knew, the real danger was only just beginning. 3 days after the wedding hall doors finally opened, I sat in a room built for someone far more important than me, staring at a wall covered in symbols I could not read, wondering how quickly my life had turned into something I no longer recognized. The palace had given me quarters near the royal wing, a suite larger than any apartment I had ever lived in, with tall windows that looked out over gardens that seemed to belong more to a dream than to any real place. It should have felt like a reward. Instead, it felt like a very comfortable cage. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Princess Iseri standing there, dressed simply for once, without the layers of ceremonial fabric she had worn at the wedding. She looked tired, though she carried it well, the way someone does when they have spent years learning not to show weakness in front of others. I thought we should talk, she said, before my father decides to make more decisions for both of us. I stepped aside to let her in, and she walked past me to the window, looking out over the gardens in silence for a long moment before speaking again. Do you understand what you agreed to? She asked. Honestly, not entirely, I admitted. I understand I am supposed to protect you. I understand there is more to the role than that, politically speaking, but nobody has explained the details clearly. She turned to face me, arms crossed, studying me the way I imagine a commander studies a new piece of equipment before deciding whether it can be trusted in the field. The old law was written for a different time, she said. Back then, a chosen protector was expected to eventually become a spouse, uniting the royal line with new blood, new strength, new alliances. My father invoked a law that has not been used in 3 centuries because he needed something powerful enough to stop Prince Cavil's house from claiming the throne through marriage. So this was never really about me, I said. It was about stopping Cavell. It was about both, she said. My father does not do anything for a single reason. He saw an opportunity to remove a dangerous alliance and strengthen a new one at the same time. You happened to be standing in the right place when that opportunity presented itself. I appreciated her honesty more than I expected to. There was no attempt to soften the truth. No diplomatic performance meant to make me feel more special than I actually was in this equation. "And what do you want?" I asked. "Not your father, not the kingdom. You." The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a moment, looking back out the window. "I want to survive long enough to make my own choices someday," she said finally. "For now, that means accepting whatever keeps me furthest from a forced marriage to a house that tried to have my father killed at my own wedding." It was not exactly an endorsement of me personally, but it was an honest answer, and I found myself respecting her more for it. Before either of us could say anything else, an alarm sounded somewhere deep in the palace, low and urgent, followed by the sound of running footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Yseri's expression shifted instantly from thoughtful to alert. "That is the perimeter alarm," she said. "Something has breached the outer gardens." We moved together without discussing it, out into the hallway where palace guards were already rushing past, weapons drawn, voices sharp with urgent commands I could not fully translate. I grabbed the sidearm I had been issued after the wedding, still unfamiliar in my hand, and followed the flow of guards toward the gardens. Chancellor Ashcroft met us halfway, his usually calm face tight with concern. "Someone attempted to enter the Eastern Archive," he said. "The archive holding the original marriage contracts and the records of Prince Cavill's house." "Did they get in?" Yseri asked. "They were stopped at the outer wall," the Chancellor said, "but not before setting a small device meant to destroy the records inside. We believe it was an attempt to erase evidence linking House Dorn to the attack at the wedding." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not random chaos. This was a coordinated effort to protect Prince Cavill's house from consequences, which meant whoever was behind it had resources, patience, and a clear plan. "Where is the intruder now?" I asked. "Guards have him contained near the garden wall," the Chancellor said. "But he is refusing to speak, and we cannot hold him indefinitely without formal cause." "Take me there," I said. Yseri moved to follow, and though every instinct told me to insist she stay somewhere safer, I had already learned enough about her in 3 days to know that suggestion would go nowhere. We reached the garden wall to find a tense standoff between 4 palace guards and a lone figure pressed against the stone, dressed in dark traveling clothes with no visible house markings. He was smaller than the guards around him, but he held himself with the kind of calm that suggested training, not panic. "Step back," I told the guards, moving closer myself. The man's eyes flicked toward me, taking in my human features with something between surprise and calculation. "You're the one they chose," he said quietly. "The human. And you're the one who just tried to burn evidence connecting your employer to an assassination attempt," I said. "Let's start there." He said nothing, but his hand shifted slightly toward his side, and years of training kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. I closed the distance and caught his wrist before it reached whatever he had been reaching for, pinning it firmly against the stone wall without applying more force than necessary. "I would not do that," I said. "Not with this many guards watching." For a moment, he strained against my grip, testing it, and I could tell he was surprised by how solid it was. Humans were not known among these people for physical strength compared to some of the larger alien species in the Alliance, but strength was never the only thing that mattered in a struggle like this. Leverage, timing, and control mattered just as much, and those were things I understood well. He finally relaxed, and the guards moved in to properly restrain him. "Search him," I said, stepping back. "Carefully." They found a small data drive hidden in the lining of his jacket, along with a folded letter written in a formal noble script I could not read but that made the Chancellor's expression darken considerably as he scanned it. "This confirms it," the Chancellor said grimly. "Instructions from House Dorn, detailing the destruction of the archive records, along with payment terms for the man who attacked the king during the ceremony." Yseri stepped closer to examine the letter herself, her jaw tightening as she read. "My father needs to see this immediately," she said. We moved quickly back through the gardens toward the palace, the captured intruder secured between 2 guards behind us, the letter carried carefully by the Chancellor like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. As we walked, Yseri glanced at me, something new in her expression, something that had not been there during our earlier conversation. "You moved faster than any guard here," she said. "Faster than I expected." "I've had practice," I said simply. "It is more than practice," she said. "The others hesitate before acting, even when danger is obvious, because they are trained to consider consequence and honor before action. You do not hesitate at all." I thought about how to explain that without making it sound like an insult to her entire culture. Where I come from, hesitation gets people hurt more often than mistakes do. We are taught to act first and sort out the details afterward, because sometimes there isn't time for anything else. She considered that for a long moment as we walked, and I could see her turning the idea over carefully, testing it against everything she had been raised to believe. My father was right about one thing, she finally said. Whatever you are not like anyone else in this alliance. We reached the throne room to find the king already waiting, alerted by runners who had gone ahead of us. His expression, when the Chancellor handed him the letter, shifted from concern to something colder and far more dangerous. House Dorn has declared war on this kingdom, without ever raising a single blade, the king said quietly, reading through the evidence twice before setting it down. They believed they could remove my daughter's protection through treachery instead of honor. What happens now? I asked. Now, the king said, his eyes moving to me with a weight I had not felt from him since the moment he chose me in that hall. House Dorn will invoke the only path left available to them, a formal challenge. They will demand a trial by combat to prove their innocence, knowing full well that if their champion wins, the marriage contract with my daughter is restored, evidence or no evidence. And if I refuse the challenge? I asked. Then the old law states the crown must yield the point by default, the Chancellor said gravely. Refusing a formal challenge is considered an admission of wrongdoing under our oldest customs. I looked at Yseri, who was watching me with an expression that had shifted once more, no longer simply curious or cautious, but something closer to genuine concern. You do not have to accept this, she said quietly. This is not the fight you signed on for. I thought about the man I had disarmed in the garden, about the letter detailing a plan to burn evidence and silence witnesses, about a prince who had tried to have a king murdered at his own daughter's wedding and was now hiding behind ritual and tradition to escape the consequences. I think it became my fight the moment I grabbed that weapon in the wedding hall, I said. I'm not backing away from it now. The king studied me for a long moment before giving a single, firm nod. Then prepare yourself, he said. House Dorn will not fight fairly, whatever they claim publicly. Their champion is known throughout the alliance for skill few have matched in generations. I felt the weight of what was coming settle over me, heavier than anything I had carried since arriving on this world. I've never lost a fight I was willing to finish, I said, though even as I said it, I understood that this fight would be unlike anything I had faced before. Fought under rules I barely understood, against an opponent trained his entire life for exactly this moment. Yseri's eyes met mine, and for the first time since the wedding hall, I saw something there that looked less like calculation and more like genuine worry for a person, rather than a political asset. Then we had better prepare quickly, she said. Because House Dorn will not wait long to demand this trial, and when they do, all of this kingdom, and every allied world watching, will be watching you. The formal challenge arrived the following morning, carried by a messenger from House Dorn dressed in black and silver, who read the declaration aloud in the throne room, without a trace of hesitation in his voice. House Dorn demands trial by combat, the messenger announced, to restore the honor of Prince Cavil and to prove the innocence of our house against false accusations made in the king's court. Our champion will meet the human protector in the arena 3 days from now, under the old rules, witnessed by all allied houses. The king accepted the declaration with a calm expression that did not match the tension I could feel radiating from him. The challenge is accepted, he said. 3 days. 3 days was not much time to prepare for a fight against someone who had trained an entire lifetime under rules I barely understood. I spent the first day simply trying to learn what those rules actually were. Chancellor Ashcroft met me in a private training hall that afternoon, along with a small group of palace guards assigned to help prepare me for whatever I was about to face. Trial by combat under the old rules follows strict boundaries, the Chancellor explained, pacing slowly across the polished floor. Both fighters use a single blade of matching length, no projectile weapons, no armor beyond ceremonial dress, no assistance from outside the ring once the match begins. The fight ends when one combatant yields, is disarmed, or can no longer continue. And House Dorn's champion? I asked. What do we know about him? His name is Garrick Solane, the Chancellor said, and something in his voice grew heavier as he said it. He has fought 11 trials by combat in the last 20 years, and has never lost one. He trains in a discipline that treats the blade as an extension of the body, refined over decades of formal instruction. I absorbed that information carefully. 11 wins against opponents who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of combat was not a small thing to overcome in 3 days. I need to see him fight, I said. Even old recordings, anything. The Chancellor arranged it within the hour, and I spent that evening watching every recorded match of Garrick Solane's career that the palace archives contained. What I saw was exactly as advertised. Precise, controlled, patient. He never wasted movement. He never took unnecessary risks. He simply waited for his opponent to make a mistake, and then he ended the fight in a single decisive moment. It was beautiful, in a strange way, the same way a perfectly executed plan is beautiful. It was also, I realized as I kept watching, entirely predictable. Every fight followed the same pattern. Every opponent tried to match his patience, tried to fight him on his own terms, waiting for an opening that Garrick controlled from the very first exchange. Nobody had ever tried to break that pattern entirely. The next morning I asked Yseri to walk with me through the palace training grounds, partly to clear my head and partly because I had begun to value her perspective more than I expected to when this whole situation started. "You have been quiet since the messenger arrived," she said as we walked. "I've been thinking about how to beat someone who has never lost," I said. "Everyone who has fought him tried to be patient, controlled, careful. That is exactly what he wants. That is exactly how he wins." "You have a different plan," she said. It was not a question. "I fight differently," I said. "Where I come from, we don't train for duels between two people standing politely across from each other, waiting for the perfect opening. We train for chaos. Uneven ground, unexpected movement, using whatever advantage exists in the moment, instead of waiting for a clean opportunity that might never come." She considered this as we walked past a row of training dummies, each one marked with the careful, precise strike patterns of generations of noble combat training. "That may work in your favor," she said, "or it may be seen as dishonorable, which could turn public opinion against you regardless of the outcome. Then I need to win in a way that looks controlled, even if it doesn't feel that way," I said. She stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "There is something else you should know," she said. "My father has received word that House Dorn is not simply relying on Garrick's skill to win this trial. There have been reports of contact between House Dorn and a faction from beyond our borders, a faction that has been probing the edges of this alliance for years, testing weaknesses." That got my full attention. "What kind of faction?" "We call them the Ashbourne Collective," she said. "A group that has never joined the alliance, that believes species like yours, newer arrivals with unusual strength and unpredictability, threaten the old balance of power among the established houses. If House Dorn wins this trial and reclaims the marriage contract, some believe it opens a door for the Ashbourne to gain influence within this kingdom, through the restored alliance with House Dorn." The picture forming in my mind was larger and darker than I had expected. This was never just about a jilted prince and a broken engagement. This was about a much bigger struggle happening in the shadows of the alliance, one that had chosen this wedding as its opening move. "So if I lose this fight," I said slowly, "it isn't just Cavil who wins, it's them." "Yes," she said quietly, "which is why I need you to understand exactly what is at stake before you step into that arena." I spent the final 2 days training harder than I had trained in years, working with the palace guards to adapt their weapons and stances into something closer to what I actually knew, blending the formal blade work required by the trial's rules with the unpredictable, adaptive instincts that had kept me alive through every dangerous assignment in my career. On the morning of the trial, the arena filled faster than the wedding hall had, representatives from every allied world gathering to witness what the palace criers were already calling the trial of the century. Word of the assassination attempt, the broken engagement, and the king's unprecedented choice had spread across the alliance in days, and now everyone wanted to see how it would end. I stood at one end of the sand-covered arena floor, dressed in simple protective clothing that felt far too light compared to the ceremonial armor worn by Garrick Solane as he entered from the opposite side. He moved with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this 11 times before and expected the 12th to end exactly the same way. Yseri sat beside her father in the royal viewing box, her expression carefully composed, though I caught her eyes finding mine just before the trial began, and something in that brief look steadied me more than I expected. The Chancellor stepped into the center of the arena to announce the rules one final time, then retreated to the edge as both blades were presented and checked for fairness. Garrick took his position across from me, blade raised in a formal stance I recognized from the recordings, patient, controlled, waiting. I did not take the matching stance. Instead, I stayed low, weight balanced, blade held less formally, more like a tool than a ceremonial object. I saw a flicker of confusion cross his face before he settled back into practiced calm. The Chancellor gave the signal, and the trial began. Garrick did exactly what I expected. He waited, testing the distance between us with small, controlled steps, watching for me to commit to an attack he could counter with the precision that had won him 11 straight victories. I refused to give him that opening. Instead of advancing in a straight line the way every one of his previous opponents had, I moved sideways, forcing him to adjust his angle, breaking the clean geometry his training relied on. He followed, slightly less certain now, and I kept moving, circling, never staying still long enough for him to settle into his rhythm. The crowd murmured, uncertain what to make of a fighter who refused to engage directly. I could hear whispers questioning whether I was afraid, whether the human champion had already lost his nerve. I let them think that. When Garrick finally grew impatient enough to close the distance himself, breaking his own pattern for the first time in the fight, I was ready for it. His strike came fast and precise, exactly as it had in every recording I had studied, but instead of meeting it head-on the way his previous opponents always had, I stepped inside the arc of his blade instead of retreating from it, closing the distance so tightly that his weapon's advantage disappeared entirely. For the first time in 11 trials, Garrick Solane looked genuinely surprised. We exchanged close, fast movements after that, nothing like the formal duel the crowd had expected, more like the kind of desperate, adaptive combat I had trained for my entire career. He was still skilled, still dangerous, still capable of turning any small mistake into a decisive strike, but I had taken away the one thing he relied on most, the comfortable distance and predictable rhythm that had carried him through every previous fight. At one point, his blade caught my shoulder, a shallow but painful cut that drew a sharp gasp from the crowd. I felt the sting of it, but I did not slow down. If anything, it sharpened my focus, cutting through the noise of the arena until there was nothing left but the fight in front of me. I found my opening a few exchanges later, when Garrick tried to reset the distance between us, falling back into the formal stance that had never failed him before. But I did not let him reset. I closed the gap again before he could settle, catching his blade with mine at an angle that twisted it from his grip and sent it clattering across the sand. The arena went completely silent. Garrick stood there for a long moment, empty-handed, staring at me with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between disbelief and something close to respect. "Yield," I said, my blade steady, though every muscle in my body was screaming with exhaustion. He looked past me, toward the royal viewing box, toward the king and Princess Useri watching in tense silence, and then back at me. "I yield," he said quietly. The arena erupted, thousands of voices rising at once, though I could not tell in that moment whether the sound was cheering or shock or some confused mixture of both. I lowered my blade, breathing hard, my shoulder aching where his strike had caught me, and looked up toward the royal box. Useri was on her feet, her composed expression finally cracking into something raw and relieved, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that we had actually won something. But even as the crowd celebrated around us, I caught sight of a small group near the arena's edge, dressed in unfamiliar dark robes with no house markings I recognized, watching the outcome with expressions that held none of the relief or celebration filling the rest of the crowd. Whoever they were, they had come expecting a different result, and the trial's outcome had clearly not gone the way they had planned. The healers finished wrapping my shoulder within an hour of the trial ending, and by the time I made it back to the royal wing, the entire palace was already buzzing with news of the outcome. House Dorn had lost, publicly and decisively, and their claim on Princess Useri's marriage contract had been formally dissolved before the sun set. I should have felt relief. Instead, I could not stop thinking about the group of dark-robed strangers watching from the arena's edge, their expressions carrying none of the celebration around them. Useri found me on the balcony outside my quarters that evening, looking out over gardens lit by the soft glow of evening lanterns. "You should be resting," she said, though she did not sound particularly convinced I would listen to that advice. "I keep thinking about the ones who left the arena early," I said, "the strangers in the dark robes. Nobody else seemed to notice them, or if they did, nobody wanted to talk about it." Her expression shifted, confirming that she had noticed them too. "Those were Ashbourne observers," she said quietly. "My father's intelligence network confirmed it an hour ago. They were sent to witness the trial and report the outcome back to their leadership. Which means they know their plan failed," I said. "Which means they will not wait patiently to try again," she said. Before I could respond, a guard appeared at the balcony entrance, breathless and urgent. "Princess, the king requests you and the human protector in the war room immediately. There has been a development." We followed him through corridors that had grown noticeably tenser since the trial, guards stationed more heavily than usual at every intersection, until we reached the war room where King Threxon stood over a wide table displaying a shifting map of the kingdom and its surrounding territories. "Ethan," the king said as we entered, using my name directly for the first time since choosing me in the wedding hall. "I owe you an explanation I should have given days ago." "I'm listening," I said. The king gestured toward the map, where a cluster of markers pulsed near the kingdom's outer border. "The Ashbourne Collective has spent the last decade probing every allied world for weaknesses, testing which houses could be turned, which alliances could be broken, which traditions could be exploited against us. They found their opening in House Dorne's ambition and Prince Cavill's arrogance." "You knew about this before the wedding," I said. It was not a question. The king's expression did not waver. "I suspected it. I did not have proof until the archive letter your quick thinking helped secure. But I had reason to believe House Dorne's loyalty was compromised long before the ceremony began." "Then why let the wedding happen at all?" Yseri asked, her voice sharper than I had heard it before. "Why let me stand at that altar if you already doubted them?" "Because I needed proof, not suspicion," the king said. "And because I needed a variable the Ashbourne could not predict or plan around. Every noble house in this alliance operates according to patterns centuries old, patterns easily studied and exploited by an enemy, patient enough to wait for the right moment. Humanity has no such pattern yet. Your instincts, Ethan, your willingness to act without waiting for permission or precedent, that unpredictability, is exactly what this kingdom needed at that exact moment." I felt something settle into place, a piece of the puzzle I had been missing since that first night in the wedding hall. "You seated me close enough to matter on purpose," I said slowly. "The whole thing with the serving tray, the crowded seating near the front, that wasn't an accident." The king allowed the faintest hint of something that might have been a smile. "I placed representatives from every species near enough to the front to react if danger arose. I did not know which of you would move first. I only hoped someone would." Yseri stared at her father, and I could see her processing this new layer of manipulation with a complicated mixture of anger and grudging understanding. "You gambled my wedding, and my future, on the hope that a stranger would act bravely at the right moment. I gambled everything on the hope that this kingdom would survive a threat most of our people do not even know exists yet," the king said, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like regret. "I am not proud of the cost, Yseri. But I would make the same choice again if it meant keeping the Ashbourne from gaining a foothold inside these walls." Before the conversation could continue, an alarm began sounding through the palace, different from the perimeter alert we had heard days earlier, deeper and more urgent, the kind of alarm reserved for genuine crisis. A guard burst into the war room moments later. "Your Majesty, unauthorized vessels have entered the outer atmosphere. Ashbourne markings confirmed. They are moving toward the palace grounds." The king's expression hardened instantly into something cold and decisive. "They intended to win through the trial first," he said. "Now that plan has failed. They intend to take what they want by force before the Alliance can respond." "How many vessels?" I asked. 6, according to initial reports, the guard said. "Small transport class, likely carrying ground forces rather than heavy weapons. They appear to be targeting a direct assault on the palace itself." The king turned to his war advisors, already issuing rapid commands to mobilize the palace guard and alert the broader kingdom's defense network. I felt the old, familiar clarity settle over me, the kind that had always come during moments exactly like this one, when planning gave way to action. "Your Majesty," I said, "your guards are trained for ceremonial duels and formal combat. They are not prepared for a coordinated ground assault by a force that has spent years planning exactly this kind of operation." "What do you propose?" the king asked. "Let me help coordinate the defense," I said. "I've spent my career training for chaos, not ceremony. Your guards know this palace better than I ever could, but I know how to fight an enemy that doesn't follow the old rules." The king studied me for a long moment, before nodding sharply. "Do it." What followed was the longest hour of my life. I worked alongside the palace guard commanders, adapting their formal defensive positions into something more flexible, using the palace's own layout, its narrow corridors and unexpected turns, as advantages against an enemy expecting to face predictable resistance. Yseri refused to be moved to a secure location, insisting on staying close to the command post where she could relay information between defensive units faster than any messenger could manage alone. I did not argue with her. There was no time, and honestly, I had learned by then that arguing with her rarely accomplished anything productive. The Ashbourne forces breached the outer gardens within the first 20 minutes, moving with disciplined efficiency that confirmed everything the king had warned about their training and preparation. But they had planned for an enemy following centuries-old defensive patterns, not for a defense reshaped around unpredictable, adaptive tactics learned from a species they had clearly underestimated. I found myself at the front of the palace's inner defense line when the first wave of Ashborn soldiers pushed through the garden entrance, their equipment sleek and unfamiliar, their coordination sharp and professional. For a moment, the old instincts I had built an entire career around took over completely, guiding decisions faster than conscious thought could keep pace with. We held the line at the inner courtyard, using the terrain against an enemy that had expected open, formal engagement instead of the chaotic, close-quarters resistance we gave them instead. Guards who had spent their entire careers training for honorable duels adapted faster than I expected, learning in real time how to fight an enemy that respected no rules at all. At one point, during the thickest part of the fighting, I spotted a figure moving through the chaos toward the command post where Yseri stood coordinating defensive positions, a lone Ashborn operative who had slipped past the main line entirely, moving with clear purpose toward the one target that mattered most to their entire operation. I broke away from the courtyard defense without hesitation, cutting through the garden paths as fast as I could move, arriving at the command post just as the operative closed the final distance toward Yseri. I do not remember every detail of what happened next, only the desperate speed of it, the way training and instinct blurred together into something faster than conscious thought, the way I managed to place myself between the operative and Yseri just as he made his final approach. What I remember clearly is the moment it ended, the operative subdued and disarmed, Yseri standing behind me, breathing hard but unharmed, her hand gripping my uninjured shoulder tightly enough that I could feel it even through the adrenaline still coursing through me. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice tight with something that had nothing to do with royal composure anymore. "I'm fine," I said, and for once it was actually true. The battle for the palace lasted just under 2 hours before the remaining Ashborn forces, realizing their assault had failed to achieve its objective and unwilling to sustain further losses, retreated back toward their waiting vessels and fled the kingdom's airspace entirely. Allied reinforcements arrived shortly after, too late to participate in the fighting, but in time to confirm that the immediate threat had passed. The days that followed brought a flood of activity across the kingdom, formal condemnations issued against the Ashborn Collective, renewed alliance meetings addressing the vulnerabilities the attack had exposed, and a noticeably different tone in how representatives from other worlds spoke about humanity's role in the broader alliance. I stood beside the king roughly a week later, in a formal gathering of allied representatives called to address the aftermath of the attack, watching as he addressed the assembled crowd with a clarity and weight that reminded me exactly why he had held his throne through so many years of careful, difficult decisions. 3 months ago, the king said, many in this alliance questioned whether humanity belonged among us at all, whether a species so young, so unfamiliar with our traditions, could ever contribute meaningfully to our shared future. I confess, even I harbored doubts I did not voice publicly. He paused, his gaze finding me among the gathered officials. Those doubts ended in my own wedding hall, when a stranger from a world we barely understood acted with courage that saved my life before any of my own trained guards could react. Those doubts ended again in an arena, when that same stranger defeated an opponent who had never lost, using instincts and adaptability that our oldest traditions never prepared us to counter. And those doubts ended entirely, 3 days ago, when this kingdom faced an enemy patient enough to spend years planning our downfall, and it was humanity's unpredictable courage, standing shoulder to shoulder with our own guards, that helped hold this palace until reinforcement arrived. The crowd remained silent, listening intently as the king continued. I am formally elevating humanity's status within this alliance, effective immediately, he announced. No longer as a newly arrived species to be tolerated at the edges of our councils, but as a full and respected member, whose voice carries equal weight in matters concerning our shared future. The applause that followed was nothing like the hesitant, scattered reaction I had heard in the wedding hall weeks earlier. This time, it filled the entire chamber, steady and genuine, and I felt something in my chest loosen that I had not even fully realized was tense until that moment. Later that evening, I found Yseri in the same garden where the Ashborn operative had once tried to reach her, standing quietly beneath the same lanterns that had lit our earlier conversations. Your father's speech was generous, I said, joining her by the low garden wall. He meant every word of it, she said, though I suspect he also enjoyed reminding every house that doubted his choice how thoroughly he was proven right. I laughed, quietly, and she allowed herself a small smile in return. What happens now? I asked. For us, I mean. The bond, the title, all of it. She considered the question carefully before answering. The old law never required anything beyond protection and guardianship unless both parties chose to pursue something further, she said. I told you once that I wanted the chance to make my own choices someday. I think, for the first time in my life, I actually have that chance now. And what would you choose? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, something warm and genuine in her expression that had nothing to do with politics or duty or ancient laws. I think I would like to find out what that looks like, she said. Together, if you are willing. I thought about the wedding hall, about the empty chair I had been assigned weeks earlier, about how far that unremarkable seat in the back row had carried me since that night. I thought about a kingdom that had once barely acknowledged my presence and now stood ready to call humanity its equal. I think I would like that too, I said. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, I knew, the Ashbourne Collective had not disappeared entirely, and whatever conflict lay ahead would demand far more from both of us than a single trial or a single battle ever could. But standing in that quiet garden, beside a princess who had chosen her own path for the first time in her life, I found myself, for once, not dreading whatever came next. I had arrived at a wedding I was never meant to matter at, expecting nothing more than a quiet, forgettable evening in the back row of history. I left it instead as the beginning of something far larger than I could have imagined, a bond between two people who had never chosen each other, and a turning point for an entire species that had finally found its place among the stars.